have an absolutely insane video for you guys today. I have gathered all the most intense and graphic Apache gunship combat footage I could find and stuffed it all in one long video. Due to YouTube's community guidelines, I'm allowed to show more graphic footage later in the video, which means this video literally gets better the longer you watch it, so make sure you stay till the end. And if you get to the end of the video and still want more footage, be sure to check out the Patreon links down in the description for exclusive uncensored footage. With that being said, be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoy the video, and let's get right into it. On April 23rd, 2011, a US Army helicopter crashed in an area swarming with armed hostiles in Kapisa Province, Afghanistan. As soon as the calls about the helicopter crash came over the radio, the 83rd Expeditionary Squadron at Bagram Airfield sent out two Air Force Pavehawk helicopters to respond to the crash. Their call signs were Pedro 83 and Pedro 84. Upon arrival at the crash site, the Pavehawks immediately started taking fire from the enemy. In the chaos, Pedro 83 somehow spotted one of the pilots who had crawled up onto a ridge about 300 meters uphill from the crash site. And despite small arms fire still slamming into the side of the helicopter, Pedro 83 managed to lower its three pararescuemen onto the ridge. Meanwhile, Pedro 84, who was also under heavy fire from the enemy, dropped its two pararescuemen, Staff Sergeants Zachary Klein and Bill Senna, as close to the crash site as possible. At the crash site, the two PJs found that the pilot had unfortunately passed away, and they started preparing to hoist him out and into their Pavehawk. But unfortunately, the enemy wasn't going to let that happen without a fight. Right after dropping Klein and Senna on the ground, Pedro 84's flight engineer was shot in the leg, and the Pavehawk had to fly back to Bagram to get him medical attention. Enemy fire also forced Pedro 83 to cut its hoist cable and do a daring one-wheel hover in the combat zone just to get its three PJs and the surviving pilot back aboard. And that left Klein and Senna stuck on the ground in the combat zone alone with the fallen pilot. But thankfully, they weren't alone for long, as an AH-64 Apache helicopter arrived on target and started providing air cover.
Alright, you got him? Okay, pushing in here, that's where he's sparkling right here.
Yeah,
there they are. There they are.
Alright, was done.
There. Okay.
Yep, engage.
Okay.
Fire, we have contact.
Okay. Firing.
Where you at? Approach into 27. Engage.
At this point, the two PJs along with the fallen pilot were taking cover behind some big rocks near the crash site when they noticed the fire at the crash site started spreading and getting bigger. Thankfully, Klein spotted a rocket pod that was still full of unexploded rockets attached to the side of the helicopter, and he made the very wise judgment call to get the heck away from the crash site. Thankfully, the Apache overhead was able to give them enough cover fire for them to sprint from the rocks to a nearby ravine, and as they were sprinting away from the crash site, the helicopter exploded. Thankfully, the PJs weren't wounded by the explosion, but bits of molten metal can still be found on Klein's body armor to this day. The PJs were now taking cover in the ravine, but the situation was getting worse. Despite the Apache gunship's best efforts, the enemy was closing in on their position, and the ravine was offering them very little cover. Captain Rustin Trainham and Captain Mike Hilkert, both of the 74th Expeditionary Rescue Squadron, were off supporting other ground forces nearby when a call for help came over the guard frequency. As soon as the A-10s arrived on target, they began surveying the area to figure out where the PJs were located and where the enemy was located. At the same time, Hilkert began setting up airspace restrictions and communications relays to the Air Support Operations Center, the Combined Air Operations Center, and Joint Personnel Recovery Center. They also shot rockets into the valley to give Klein and Senna some breathing room, but it didn't last long. Despite the A-10s absolutely hammering the enemy for half an hour, the PJs were now pinned down by close-range heavy machine gun fire. Hilkert's A-10 was running low on fuel, so he hooked up to an aerial refueling tanker that was flying over the target location. While he was hooking up to the refueling tanker to get more fuel, he was still marking targets just 50 meters away from Klein and Senna's position. With the enemy's exact danger close location now marked, Hilkert's wingman was able to open up with his 30mm cannons, saving Klein's and Senna's lives. Later that morning, a 32-man Army Quick Reaction Force landed at 2 locations on the battlefield and was immediately attacked. 1 soldier was killed and several more were wounded. At this point, Hilkert was in complete control of coordinating all air support in the area. He was marking enemy positions while simultaneously monitoring and marking the locations of one half of the QRF with his binoculars and the other with his targeting pods to ensure that all the aircraft in the area knew exactly where the friendlies were so they could lay down fire on the enemy without risk of hitting friendlies. All in all, Hilkert used 37 different radio frequencies to coordinate 21 aircraft, all while flying his own aircraft and engaging enemy targets. And if that wasn't enough, when a handful of Pavehawks and Apache helicopters eventually moved in to evacuate the wounded Quick Reaction Force soldiers, Hilkert flew his A-10 between the helicopters and the enemy multiple times, drawing all of the enemy's fire onto himself and his aircraft and away from the helicopters. And thanks to his incredibly heroic actions, literally using himself and his aircraft as a shield for his teammates, the helicopters were able to evacuate the wounded soldiers. And at this point in the battle, Hilkert had been in the cockpit of his A-10 for over 10 straight hours. But thankfully, Hilkert didn't have to stay and see this mission all the way through, as Pedro 84 returned to the combat zone to pick up the 2 pararescuemen and the fallen pilot. But this time, Pedro 84 brought backup. 4 fully loaded A-10 Thunderbolts came in right behind Pedro 84 to replace Hilkert. And with the A-10s completely obliterating what was left of the enemy force, Pedro 84 was able to successfully recover the pararescuemen and the fallen pilot. Overall, Hilkert helped secure 2 landing zones, rescue 2 pararescuemen, recover the fallen pilot, and evacuate 32 QRF soldiers. And for his heroic actions that day, Hilkert was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. On June 24th, 2006, O'Connor's team of Green Berets and a handful of Afghan National Army soldiers were on a kill or capture mission southwest of Kandahar, when they walked right into a Taliban ambush and found themselves completely surrounded by over 200 Taliban insurgents. And as you can imagine, all hell broke loose. The Green Berets immediately found cover and began returning accurate fire on the enemy, somewhat repelling the ambush. The team leader, Master Sergeant Thomas Mahalik, then used an unmanned aerial drone to lead a few of the Green Berets to what appeared to be the Taliban command center just outside a nearby cemetery. But as they neared the location, the Taliban very quickly pulled back, which was extremely concerning and weird because the Green Berets were obviously vastly outnumbered by the Taliban, so why would they give up their position so quickly? Well, it turns out the Taliban had planned ahead and set up a heavily fortified machine gun position just behind the cemetery, and now the Green Berets were stuck in the middle of the kill zone right where the Taliban wanted them. The Taliban machine gunner quickly opened up on the Green Berets position, pinning them down. But Staff Sergeant Matthew Binney, Staff Sergeant Joe Fewhurst, and the team's translator made the brave decision to separate from the rest of the team in hopes of flanking the machine gunner and providing cover fire for their teammates. But as they moved, the machine gun fire fractured Binney's skull and shattered his shoulder, and a rocket-propelled grenade hit Fewhurst in the chest, thankfully didn't explode, but the blunt force trauma critically wounded him. The machine gun fire on them was so heavy that Benny later found bullet holes in his camelback water bladder and 6 bullet holes in his pants. The wounded Green Berets were now laying down on their faces in the dirt with just enough cover where the machine gun fire was going right over the top of their backs. Needless to say, this was a very bad position and they needed medical care immediately.
This is Tango 1. Coming to the roof as well.
O'Connor knew he had to do something quick to retrieve his teammates before they were killed or captured. At this point, the wounded Green Berets were so close to the Taliban that the team's translator could hear them taunting him, telling him that if he provided medical aid to his teammates so they could be captured alive, he would be forgiven. Thankfully, a 14-inch deep ditch stretched across the field that separated O'Connor from his wounded teammates. So he quickly began the dangerous low crawl to his teammates. But as O'Connor crawled through the ditch, his body armor and pouches filled with dirt, raising his body off of the ground, exposing him to machine gun fire. So he made the incredibly brave decision to actually pull back to cover and remove his body armor so he could complete the crawl to his teammates. Unfortunately, the Taliban machine gunners quickly realized what O'Connor was trying to do and began focusing their fire on his position as he crawled. The machine gun fire going right over the top of O'Connor's body was so intense that it was literally mowing down the grass around him. Thankfully, the team leader Mahalik was able to climb on top of a nearby roof. Doing so put himself in a terribly exposed and dangerous position, but from that rooftop he was able to hold back the Taliban and keep them from overrunning O'Connor's position. With Mahalik's support, O'Connor began dragging his wounded teammates back through the ditch to safety. And thanks to Mahalik's support, O'Connor was able to get his 2 wounded teammates and their translator back to safety. But unfortunately, in the process, Mahalik was struck in the head by a bullet and killed. And Fewhurst also succumbed to his wounds as O'Connor dragged him to safety. Benny did make it to safety alive, though he was in very poor condition. Mahalik's death now left O'Connor in command. The men were not sure any of them would make it out of here without being killed or captured, so some of them took a small moment to write letters to their loved ones. But just when it seemed like all hope was lost, multiple AH-64 Apache gunships rolled in on their position and began raining heavy gunfire down on the Taliban.
Heads up where your hands up.
Come back to the left.
Zoom 02, tell us me.
Zoom 2.
But even with the gunships tearing through the Taliban's numbers, the Green Berets were still completely surrounded. But thankfully, the Apache gunships were able to clear a path of all enemy fighters and then used an IR laser that could only be seen through the Green Berets' night vision goggles to lead the team about 600 meters in total darkness to safety. The Green Berets crawled their way out of the kill zone following the laser, while the gunships absolutely tore apart everything that wasn't following their laser. The team was then picked up by multiple Black Hawk helicopters and taken back to base where they received some much needed medical care. For his actions that day, Master Sergeant Brendan O'Connor received the Distinguished Service Cross, and Mahalik, as well as 2 other Green Berets, received the Silver Star for their courageous actions that day.
Safe off left, that was Hazard crushing the gun.
February 3rd, 2022, American Special Forces conducted a large-scale raid on a compound in northern Syria. Their target was the leader of ISIS, al-Qurashi, who took over immediately after Delta Force killed the previous leader, al-Baghdadi, in 2019. Since taking over, al-Qurashi has been in deep hiding, trying his best to avoid following in al-Baghdadi's footsteps. But unfortunately for him, his very short time as the leader of ISIS was about to come to an extremely violent end.
I got one more down! Get down!
The 3-story compound was right in the middle of a highly populated village. But the village wasn't just full of civilians. Al-Qurashi had a massive force of armed fighters living in the village around him as his personal protection, and an even larger force living in a neighboring village. To make matters worse, he lived on the 3rd floor of the compound. The 1st floor was full of women and children, and one of al-Qurashi's top lieutenants lived on the 2nd floor as his bodyguard. American intelligence confirmed al-Qurashi's location all the way back in December of 2022, and shortly after that, an exact replica of the compound was created so the assault force could figure out the best possible way to attack it and run that plan over and over and over again until it was absolutely perfect. But unfortunately, things never go according to plan. At the time of me making this video, it has not been confirmed which Special Operations Unit conducted the raid, but it's pretty safe to assume that it was either DevGru or Delta. If and when more info comes out, I'll update this video with a pinned comment down below. At 1 o'clock in the morning on the night of the raid, multiple Black Hawk helicopters flew in low and fast, dropping the assault force right in front of the compound. Members of the 75th Ranger Regiment quickly established a perimeter and set up blocking positions to ensure enemy forces from the village couldn't get anywhere near the main assault element inside the compound, while multiple drones and Apache gunships circling overhead made sure no one from the neighboring village tried to get involved. The assault force's translator used a megaphone to tell everyone in the compound to exit peacefully. Thankfully, after about 40 minutes, all the women and children on the 1st floor came out, but the hostiles on the 2nd and 3rd floor stayed put, keeping their families with them. While all this is happening, the Rangers could see fighting-aged males moving around the village, trying to see what was going on. The men didn't appear to be armed, but a few of them were making phone calls, likely for reinforcements from the surrounding villages. But if that was the case, the gunships overhead would make short work of them. Then suddenly, machine gun fire erupted from the 2nd floor of the compound. Clearly, the enemy wasn't interested in surrendering, so it was time to make entry. The operators laid suppressive fire on the windows, forcing the enemy to stop shooting long enough for the assault team to reach the front door and breach it. Once inside, they quickly cleared every room on the 1st floor, and thankfully, it was completely empty. With the 1st floor all clear, it was time to make their way up the stairs. Meanwhile, back outside, all the gunfire had stirred up the hornet's nest. Several armed men from the village began taking shots at the Rangers and trying to move in closer to the compound, but the Rangers weren't having any of it. Their Gen 3 dual-tube night vision devices left no shadows for the enemy to hide in, and every time they attempted to push forward, the Rangers cut them down with heavy machine gun fire. A handful of enemy fighters from the nearby village attempted to make their way to the compound in an armored technical, but the Apache gunship stopped them dead in their tracks. And everyone else in the village must have seen them get blown to bits, because no one else dared to step foot out of the village after that.
Hey, Will, we're pretty high. We're only 800 meters.
Past that position by going right next to the village of Mopon.
We're completely Winchester.
Back inside the compound at the top of the stairs, Al-Qarashi's lieutenant and his wife, both armed with AKs, tried desperately to stop the operators from pushing up the stairs, but the Americans quickly overwhelmed them and reached the second floor, killing them both. With the second floor now cleared, it was time to push up the stairs to the third and final floor. But suddenly, a massive explosion shook the whole building, completely blowing the roof off and dropping large chunks of the third floor into the second floor. Miraculously, none of the operators were killed in the blast. Al-Qarashi was wearing a suicide vest, and when he heard the Americans coming up the stairs, he blew himself up, taking his entire family with him. After the explosion, the operators climbed what was left of the staircase, reaching the third floor. What they found on the top floor was straight out of a horror film. There was no physical body left to confirm the target's identity, aside from several limbs scattered around with no way to know who they belonged to. So the team did a field DNA test and found a match, confirming that Al-Qarashi had been killed in the blast.
بتشوف؟
أنا محمد سلام عليكم. أنا راح أكون هون تمام؟ أنت بتجي هيك هيك شلون تقدر؟ تطلع هيك ترفع الدرجة تمام؟ تفتح الدرج وأنا بكون موقف عرفت درجة بين فوق. أنا برأيي بلش من برا وشوف أحسن. كان هون لفوت لجوا الخط الثاني ترجع للآخر وخط بس كان
Outside, the Rangers had gunned down numerous ISIS fighters trying to save their boss, but none of them even got close to reaching the compound. Obviously, due to ISIS terrorists being disgusting piles of trash, multiple civilians were killed during the raid by the explosion from the suicide vest. But thankfully, no American troops were killed or even wounded, which is an absolute miracle. But one of the helicopters suffered a major mechanical failure and was unable to fly out, so it had to be blown up right outside the compound to keep it out of enemy hands, which is oddly similar to what happened during Operation Neptune Spear.